She stood at the edge of the grave when the lawyer's soft sentence reshaped everything. The rain had started as a memory, fine, patient drops that collected along the brim of the umbrella and traced slow paths down the polished coffin. Emily kept her hands folded as if she could fold herself small enough to slip between grief and the fact of the world. But Martin Hale's voice, low and professional, found a space at the edge of her hearing and settled there. "There's an irrevocable trust, Emily," he said, as though reading a harmless line from a ledger. "A commercial portfolio. It's substantial, roughly $500 million. $500 million. The number lodged like a stone in the hollow of her chest. Not that she could have articulated the arithmetic of it then. The sentence unspooled instead as a dozen smaller images. A ledger in Margot's neat handwriting. Jars of saved coins in the pantry. A little cash box Emily remembered from childhood where the family's habit of putting aside for a rainy day took on a literal meaning. Margot had been frugal, yes, deliberate, always saving and planning in ways Emily once teased as grandmotherly. But Margot was not a woman Emily had imagined keeping a secret empire. Around them, umbrellas opened and closed like a chorus of black feathers. People murmured condolences and stepped back. The priest spoke through the last prayers, and someone released white doves, Margot's small theatrical wish for something luminous. Emily heard the bird's wings as if through water. She had come expecting ritual and an end. Instead, she stood at the beginning of a new ledger Murphy's Law had delivered at the graveside. The funeral, which had been the closing chapter she had prepared herself to read that week, was suddenly the prologue to a different book, one in which her mother's thrift collided with the private fortunes and precarious businesses tied to a husband she had trusted. Alexander Lang approached, damp hair neatly combed despite the drizzle, dark suit clinging to him. His eyes were practiced grief, deep-set, attentive, what one might expect from a man whose face had learned to hold a stage. Around him, the press were absent by design. Alexander was careful about exposure. He reached out and took Emily's hand with a gentle, familiar grip. For a moment, for the practiced performance, they were the polished couple, mourners of a beloved mother, united. But the number under Martin's breath shifted the geometry of that unity. It reframed every ledger entry on Emily's mental shelf. If Margot had left an irrevocable trust, then someone had been keeping a secret, even from Emily. Irrevocable implied permanence, control outside of the living hand. Why had Margot not told her? Why had Alexander not known? Why did the legal papers Martin slid into Emily's palm feel like the first careful cuts of a scalpel? She left the cemetery with the damp smell of wet soil in her coat and a briefcase that felt suddenly too heavy. In the car, she let the legalese wash over her like rainwater running off a roof. Martin had been precise. The trust was irrevocable. The terms could not be unilaterally altered by a surviving spouse. It was styled in a way that distributed rents and commercial income to a trustee with discretion, and it held a portfolio of commercial properties, retail blocks, small industrial parcels, assets that produced steady rent income meant to support causes Margot favored. There were clauses, Martin said, that protected the holdings from creditors and from being commandeered by marital settlements. But he also said the words every lawyer says when a stranger's construction collides with a marriage. It's complicated. Complicated, in that moment, meant choices. Emily remembered Margot teaching her to measure a teaspoon of sugar exactly, to balance a budget for the month like a prayer. She remembered Margot bringing soup to neighbors and giving her last coat to a woman who caught her eye on a November afternoon. Margot's quiet accumulation had always implied a community beyond the family, small, careful buffers against sudden need. Emily's own life, by contrast, had been public. She had married Alexander when she was 30, charmed by a businessman who made fortunes feel incidental. Easy speeches at fundraisers, earnest to the camera philanthropy, investments and exits that turned in glossy checks. Alexander's companies rented office floors, signed leases, promised jobs. He had called Emily once from a balcony in Miami, saying with a laugh, "We're building something." He had meant buildings and the warm glow of his industries. Emily had heard the word as both. Now, standing in the parking lot, the smell of rain and wet stone, she understood she had a decision to make that felt moral and legal at once. Use whatever lay in Margot's trust to salvage Alexander's faltering empire, repair payroll, shore up lenders, keep people employed, and, in the process, keep her marriage intact. Or step into an investigatory role that could expose deceit, potentially protect the trust for its intended purpose, but risk shattering what remained of her private life. She had known betrayal intellectually. She had not yet understood how betrayal felt when it came mixed with ledgers and deeds. If the funeral was the hook that threw the question into the light, the answer would not reveal itself beneath umbrellas. It demanded evidence, a timeline, and people who could translate suspicion into proof. It demanded a reckoning that might save the very people Emily was tempted to protect. Before she could move past the decision's raw edge, she did something small and practical. She opened her phone and scrolled through messages. Nothing. Then, tucked between condolence notes from distant relatives and Alexander's brief ministering texts, a single voicemail marker blinked. A message dated 2 weeks prior. She hadn't expected it. She did what people do when feeling a small, private panic. She listened. The recording was raw and fragmentary. The hiss of static, laughter, someone, female, saying a name, a place perhaps, and an unmistakable sound of glasses touching. 10 seconds. A voice she didn't recognize. Then a male laugh she knew too well. Alexander's, light, casual, intimate. She played it again and then again, her thumb pressing the replay like a metronome. The sound of it threaded through her like a needle. The voicemail did not, in itself, prove financial wrongdoing, but it did suggest that Alexander had been keeping parts of his life, and therefore perhaps his business decisions, in rooms closed to her. Worse, the dateline on the voicemail matched a period when Alexander's company had reported a suspiciously significant transfer, one that, according to a public filing Emily later skimmed in the background, had routed through an entity with a name near identical to the trust's holding LLC. She told herself she would not be the woman who lived only in suspicion. She would get answers. The choice to investigate felt less like vengeance and more like stewardship, of Margot's legacy and of the livelihoods attached to the properties. She called one name that had come up in Martin's careful, precise talk, Sophia Ruiz. Sophia was not theatrical. She arrived with a bag that smelled faintly of old leather and paper, and a face that did not trade in politeness. Her business card was plain, the font efficient. She read Emily for 5 seconds and then took the voicemail into her possession like a specimen. "I'll tell you what I can find without leaving a paper trail that could be called into question later," she said. "Everything needs a chain you can show in court." That was the first of many sentences Emily would count on. The idea that proof had to be visible, traceable, defensible, not dramatic, but admissible. Sophia moved with the economy of someone who had seen desperation before and learned to translate it into documents. Hotel folios, credit card receipts, publicly accessible flight logs, legal filings, things that had a habit of existing whether or not anyone wanted them to. She explained, carefully, that she would not, under any circumstances, engage in illegal methods. "If you want results in court, you need evidence the court will accept," she said. Her voice had the flatness of someone who had worked too long with people who confused moral urgency with tactical good sense. "We'll build a paper trail." Day 10. The calendar felt necessary, an anchor against the spiraling possibilities. Emily marked time as if each day could be compartmentalized into tasks that would, when assembled, protect the trust and the tenants who lived in properties associated with it. On the 10th day after the funeral, Sophia delivered a packet in a plastic folder. Grainy photos of Alexander at a hotel lobby in Chicago, time-stamped. Receipt stubs with parts of his name and a corporate card number that, once traced, led to an LLC with a name echoing the trust's corporate style. An image of a tablet screen captured in low light showing an inbox subject that suggested a string of informal payments, gifts perhaps, and a folio showing a room billed in the corporate name of one of Alexander's operating companies on dates that matched the outgoing transfers. The photos had the blunt force of ordinary things. A silhouette of Alexander leaning toward another person's shoulder, a keycard charge, footprints on a wet pavement outside a hotel. They were not poison-tipped. They were simply contradictions to the timeline Alexander had offered Emily. They suggested behavior Alexander had not disclosed, and they suggested the movement of people and money in overlapping orbits. Sophia explained each item in a voice that tried to be calm but carried the undercurrent of urgency. Folios are important. They show who was billed and when. Hotels aren't discreet if you have the bill. Flight manifests are public in many cases. And when you have matching dates between transfers and travel, you start to see patterns. She tapped the folio photo on her tablet and then set it down, looking at Emily as if to say the truth was heavier than the image of it. Emily felt the world arrange itself into lists, dates, receipts, payments. It was tedious and enormous, the way something that would overturn a life often was. But it felt necessary. She told Sophia to keep digging. Day 20. They met Daniel Park in a modest conference room above a bookstore, one with a chipped table and the smell of coffee that had lived there for years. Daniel was a forensic accountant whose voice could make decimals feel like a sermon. He had the sort of calm you only get when a person has built their profession around reading numbers the way others read faces. He listened to Sophia's folio and the voicemail twice before he spoke. "Round number transfers are a red flag," he said, not loud but precise. "They suggest either an accounting convention or an attempt to camouflage the real purpose of a transfer. When you see a steady pattern of transfers moving through shell entities with no real commercial activity, you have to ask, who benefits?" He sketched a small diagram in the margin of a tablet. Alexander's operating company, a named LLC, and then the trust holding entity. Lines connected them, dotted where the connection was circumstantial, matching directors' initials, overlapping addresses, corporate filings that used the same registered agent. Daniel's job was not to declare guilt, only probability, to translate folios and transfers into a coherent pattern that a judge could understand. "For now," he said, "we package probabilities as narratives grounded in documents." Probabilities become motions. Motions become subpoenas. Subpoenas produce records. Records produce answers. Emily watched him draw arrows and felt the amazing, terrifying slow of legal machinery begin to turn. She had imagined that a lawyer's intervention might be a single dramatic summons. In reality, it was tedious, structural work, the patient assembling of threads to create a rope. They were careful. Martin insisted the trust's irrevocable nature meant it was protected against many marital claims, but he did not pretend it was invulnerable. Irrevocable doesn't mean untouchable, he explained, in the cautious voice of a probate lawyer. It means the settler intended to bind herself and provided for distribution by a trustee she trusted. A surviving spouse can't simply claim it. But a spouse can, under certain conditions, litigate fiscal interactions between marital assets and trust-held properties. If assets have been commingled, or if there is proof of fraudulent conveyance aimed at depriving creditors, that's another story. We need to be precise. We need to be defensible. The lesson Martin taught Emily and Sophia that day was legal prose rendered emotional. Money was not merely numbers, but lifelines and obligations. If Alexander had used operating company funds in ways that endangered payroll or routed trust income in ways that muffled Margot's intent, then the people who would suffer were not shareholders, but workers, tenants, family members who had rented small corner stores from Margot's holdings. Their names were small and ordinary. A baker who had borrowed a ladder for a month to repaint his shop. A daycare center that paid rent by 3 separate checks. A seamstress with an unglamorous sign in the window. The stakes leapt from the courtroom to storefronts. "We must consider the collateral," Martin said. "If we seek immediate injunctive relief, we can preserve assets pending discovery. Temporary restraining orders are blunt instruments, but effective for short windows. They buy us time to audit and to present a protective plan." Emily had imagined in an unrefined way that she could simply take control of the trust and redirect it to Margot's favorite causes. But Martin's description placed that impulse within a legal ecosystem. Timelines, filings, the risk of counter-litigation from creditors and from Alexander's counsel. Raymond Ellis, Martin reminded her, an adversary known for speed and strategic pressure. "My own counsel will be aggressive, no doubt," Martin said. "He'll push to protect his clients' operational interests. The better our paperwork, the less room we give for theatrics." Day 30. The mounting pressure through the 30-day mark came as a kind of weather, a slow front of notices. The first creditor letter Emily read made her hands go cold. Alexander's operating company was behind on payments to several vendors and had a payroll notice that might lead to liens if not resolved. The company's main account showed a late transfer to a single-name LLC that, when traced, shared a registered agent with a holding company associated with Margot's trust. When Emily asked Martin what this meant, he pushed a slim legal pad toward her and wrote 2 words, "Petition for accounting." "A petition for accounting requests detailed books and records," he said. "It forces disclosure of transactions and expenses under oath. If funds have been moved in a way to deprive the trust or to commingle assets, this is how we start to make it visible." Emily imagined a judge looking at a ledger and at that moment feeling the power to say, "Stop." For all the law's slowness, it could act like a dam if presented with enough evidence and the right emergency motions. But there was another problem that did not show up in ledgers: Alexander's private charm, which he wielded with the smoothness of practiced influence. He met Emily for dinner in the dining room of the townhome they had bought together. The china clinked in the background. A lull in the rain made the windows clear and glassy. "You look like you have a storm inside," he said, with that lightness that wanted to make everything a small theatrical problem to be solved with a smile. He reached across the table and took her hand. Emily had rehearsed neutrality. She had learned to pose questions like a professional, soft at the start, precise when needed. "I heard from Martin today," she said. It came out steadier than she felt, about the trust. Alexander's expression flickered. There was a shadow that passed like a cloud across his face. He kept his voice even. "It's old money, Emily. Your mother was careful. She did things her way." "Did she tell you?" Emily asked. "No," he said, "and I don't think it was her intent to make it anybody's business until she thought the time was right." There was a pause. The soup went cold in their bowls. Alexander's eyes found hers, practiced empathy in place. "You know I love you," he said. "Whatever you decide to do, I will respect it." It was the line of men who had come before him in films and in the world, gentle assurances that were meant to disarm. But Emily had a voicemail playing like a split-second film behind her eyes. She kept her voice low. "There's a voicemail on my phone you should know about," she said. "It's from 2 weeks ago." Alexander swallowed. "A mistake," he said. "A missent message. You know how technology is." She looked down at her hands, at a cut on her knuckle that had nothing to do with any of this. "The dates match transfer records," she said. The words felt clinical, like testifying. The room shrank to nothing but the space between them and the danger of small numbers and small lies. He touched her hand lightly. "Emily, you should not assume the worst." "I don't want to be the person who acts on assumption," she answered, "but I also don't want to let money that could help people be at risk because of secrecy." His jaw tightened for a moment, a small, human fissure in the practiced mask. "I am doing everything I can to keep the company afloat," he said. "People's jobs depend on it." "And what if the company's problems are of the company's own making?" Emily asked. "Paid bonuses? Fast expansions that hurt cash flow? What if the timing of transfers looks like it's trying to cover losses?" He gave a small laugh, an attempt to make it all sound less urgent. "You sound like Martin." She thought of Margot's hands, small and steady, and of the people who had keys to those shops. "I don't want to hurt the workers," she said. "I want to protect the trust and the tenants, if that is possible together." "Then let me help," he said. It could have been reconciliation. Instead, it felt like a request to close the investigation by letting his presence supply an answer. "Trust him," he said in other words. She wanted to trust him. She wanted the domestic theater to resolve into safety. But the recordings existed, and the folios existed, and the vendors' letters existed. They were, painfully, real. The choice was not about one dinner. It was about whether she would allow evidence to be the arbiter. Without evidence, she risked becoming the woman who had been taken in by a charming explanation. With evidence, she risked a different kind of damage. Damage to a marriage, to a public reputation that supported people's paychecks. She let him finish the sentence he wanted to give her. She accepted no promise. That night she stood alone on the balcony, the city below smelling of wet exhaust. Her hands clenched the glass railing. Her phone was a heavy thing in her pocket. She listened to the voicemail again until the words were so familiar that they lost their meaning. She had the taste of iron in her mouth, and she realized she felt less like someone betrayed and more like someone tasked. Between the domestic theater and the legal machine was the world of social events. Gala dinners and fundraiser committees where trustees and advisors mixed their smiles and their interests. Emily decided she would attend, but not for Alexander. She would go to watch and to gather the movement of people. A trustee named Eleanor Grant, who had been close to Margot in the last years, would be present at the annual benefit at the Old Opera House, a woman known for discretion and iced smiles. Emily needed to know what Eleanor knew. At the gala, Emily moved like a shadow at first. The chandeliers spilled light on dresses and suits, and the pianist played an old Cole Porter standard. People offered her condolences like currency. She listened. Eleanor found her near the hors d'oeuvres, a woman wrapped in a pale shawl that shone like mother of pearl. Margot was a remarkable woman, Eleanor said, and her voice contained both warmth and a guarded reserve. Emily kept her questions soft. Did she ever talk about plans for the properties? About trustees? Eleanor's eyes sharpened for a second. "Your mother was careful," she said. "She believed in structures. She set things up so the work would continue without her having to micromanage every tenant." "Did she say why she chose an irrevocable trust?" Emily asked. Eleanor hesitated, then allowed herself to be human for a flicker. She wanted permanence, she said. She wanted help that would persist. She didn't trust quick fixes. "Do you know who else has access to the trust's advisory circle?" Emily asked. Eleanor shrugged, the barest of motions, an admission of limits. "You'd have to ask the trustee," she said. Emily left the gala with a scrap of a name, and the image of the trustees' list folded in her mind like a map. What she gathered that night was not direct evidence, but a map of social proximities. Who ate with whom, whose smiles were guarded, which names reappeared. That map was valuable in the way a map always is. It told you where to go next. The press, for now, were respectful. The story of a hidden trust at a funeral didn't fit neatly into a front-page frenzy without a court filing or some dramatic leak. To the public, Margot's death was sorrowful and private. Privately, in a handful of lawyerly offices and among refrigerators humming with folios, a different story began to be quietly written. Sophia found a trove of small things that did what evidence does best. It made denial harder. She produced a series of images, hotel folios, luncheon receipts, a tiny chain of invoices, that all turned on a single thread: Alexander's presence in places where transfers were logged. Daniel turned those threads into a narrative of recurrence: transfers at the end of fiscal quarters that corresponded with expensive hotel stays, an LLC with a name that echoed Margot's holding company in the way a whisper echoes a song. But assembling evidence was only the beginning. The law required motion, and motion needed strategy. Martin and Daniel sketched a plan on a whiteboard that looked almost architectural. Step 1, petition for accounting. Step 2, motion for temporary restraining order to prevent dissipation of suspect assets. Step 3, prepare declaratory relief to clarify the trust's protections from marital claims. Step 4, parallel preparations to bid at public auction should certain assets be placed for sale by creditors. "We should be clear," Martin said. "There may be creditors who come in hard and fast. If assets move to auction, the market will price them at distress rates. That's when we step in. But we must avoid being seen as opportunists. Our bid must be framed as a stewardship acquisition. We must communicate that the purpose is continuity of service to tenants, not profit-taking." Emily listened. The plan's architecture felt right: careful, legal, moral. It allowed for both the protection of the trust and the mitigation of harm to workers. It also preserved her option to avoid scorched earth revenge. She found herself visiting Aisha Reynolds next. Aisha ran a tenant rights group that had been an unofficial guardian for businesses in the blocks Margot owned. She was the sort of woman whose face had been in many petitions and community council rooms. Her office smelled of printer ink and cheap coffee. Aisha wore a band of pens behind her ear like someone whose work was constant. When Emily told her about the trust, Aisha nodded as if this was the kind of story she had seen before: small resources at risk to larger financial ripples. "What do the tenants need?" Aisha asked, immediately practical. "Emergency grants? Legal clinics? Temporary bridges for rent? If payroll is at risk, people need immediate stops." Emily felt the urgency of that question as tactile as the rain. "We'll try to safeguard payroll and maintain operating incomes," she said. "Promises help until they don't," Aisha said. "So we make plans, and we make them public when the time is right. We demand accountability, not gossip." They agreed, in that modest office, to coordinate. Aisha would prepare emergency measures for tenant support and to document rent histories. Luca Moreno, a community developer Emily had known through Margot's neighborhood meetings, would look for transitional financing options that could be legally presented alongside an injunction. If Emily's team acted with legal restraint but social transparency, they might protect livelihoods even while the broader legal picture unfolded. Emily's days became a weave of the ordinary and the technical. She walked through Margot's old properties one afternoon with Luca, hearing the squeak of shutters and the casual chatter of shopkeepers. A woman named Rosa ran a bodega with faded paint and a small sign offering cash transfers and photocopies. Rosa's ledger was a cardboard box of orders and IOUs bound by rubber bands. She spoke without complaint but with worry in her voice. "If rent goes up, I cannot pay," she said. "I have no cushion." The human stakes made Emily's decisions sharp and immediate. There was no abstract villainy in their faces, only families trying to keep a small pursuit alive. At night, she sat at a desk under a lamp and read the trust documents Martin had left her. Margot's handwriting appeared in margins, small notes of charity, toggles toward specific uses. There were clauses about maintenance funds, about prioritizing tenants with long-term agreements, about preserving a fund for neighborhood emergency repairs. Margot had been precise in ways Emily had only now appreciated. She had not wanted the trust to be an engine of private enrichment. She had wanted it to be a buffer against sudden need. Emily felt the weight of that intention like a mandate. One evening, as the dry leaves began to fall, Emily returned home to find a courier at her door with a sealed envelope from an unknown law office. Inside, terse and professional, was a demand letter from Raymond Ellis, Alexander's counsel. A polite but firm request to halt any action that interfered with Alexander's legitimate management of his operating business, and a warning that any attempts to restrain funds absent clear evidence would be met with vigorous defense. It was the predictable counterweight to their plan, an early taste of the legal pressure they would face. Martin read it and put it aside, like a pebble on a desk. "They'll try to make us appear as interlopers," he said. "We must make sure every step we take is defensible and aimed at preserving the interests Margot intended." There were nights Emily lay awake thinking about how her mother had tucked unpaid bills into the back of a drawer, and how that small prudence had kept a small household going. She thought of the bodega, the daycare, the seamstress, and of Alexander's world of high-stakes negotiations and press releases that could flatter or obliterate. She did not know exactly what she expected from the law, only that it could be a tool to convert the private betrayal she felt into public protection. She resolved not to be a person who closed her eyes to either. The funeral had been a hinge, an outward event that had flipped inward. From it had spilled a ledger, a voicemail, and a set of implications that would not be quieted with a single explanation. Emily had chosen, for now, curiosity and evidence over the tidy balm of faith in a man's word. She had chosen stewardship. The last entry in her Day 30 file was a single line in her own handwriting. Protect trust. Protect tenants. Preserve dignity. And yet, with the whiteboard plan in place and an attorney's letters filed, there remained a texture to the problem that law could not yet touch. The quiet domestic half-truths Alexander might still tell, the private accounts he might keep, and the social theater he could stage to make complicity look like loyalty. She was not naive about the scale of what she was up against. Alexander's public persona was a currency. His charm lubricated negotiations and softened questions. To push him publicly risked pain for employees who trusted his name. She would need more than ledgers. She would need to make the right moves at the right time. The tension mounted toward a private encounter that would matter. Sophia texted at dusk with one line: "I have something you need to see. Come to my office at 9. When Emily stepped into Sophia's small paper-lined room at 9, Sophia was already at the table with a mug of black coffee and a stack of folios. She slid a photo across the table and then another, each one a small, incriminating tile. An image of Alexander at a construction site signing a document under a name that matched one of the Shell LLCs. A photograph of a courier receipt in Alexander's operating company envelope dated the same day a transfer was logged. A scanned invoice, disguised as a consulting fee, with a number that matched a wire to a third-party company. "This piece," Sophia said, tapping the invoice, "ties the transfer to a service that doesn't exist in reality. It's a paper service. It's paperwork that creates the plausible deniability to move money. If you link that to the board minutes that authorize the transfer and to the hotel folios that show his presence, you get circumstantial proof of commingling." Emily felt the breath leave her, as if someone had taken a small, private weight out of her hands. The evidence was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was procedural. It was monotonous and repetitive and therefore dangerous, a pattern that, when assembled, revealed intent, or at least a troubling opacity. "We do this the right way," Sophia said, and Emily heard in her voice the finality of someone who had worked years to understand where the law would accept a story and where it would not. No illegal methods, no surprises. Documents, corroboration, admissibility. If we do this right, a judge will have little choice but to allow motions that protect these assets. Emily nodded. She had the look of someone preparing for a legal turn, the way one might ready luggage for a long trip. She felt almost relieved. The funeral had been the beginning. The investigation was now underway, and, crucially, it was lawful and methodical. Outside, the city breathed on and off. The rain had stopped for a while and was starting again. Emily thought of Margot's fingers turning down the corners of pages in grocery coupons, keeping lists. Margot had kept her world small and practical. Now that small practicality was a bulwark against a very modern danger, the dissolution of responsibility into corporate obfuscation. Before she left Sophia's office, they agreed on the next steps. Daniel would continue tracing transfers and draft a report aimed at demonstrating patterns of commingling. Martin would prepare the petition for accounting and a motion for temporary restraining order if evidence suggested imminent dissipation. Aisha and Luca would begin outreach to tenants and start contingency plans for rent bridges and emergency payroll support should creditors press collection. Emily stepped out into the night with a sense that the months ahead would require a kind of endurance she had not known she possessed. The funeral had been the inciting image, the voicemail the first small tear in the curtain. Now they were moving forward, arranging a legal architecture to hold back a tide. She understood, with a clarity sharpened by grief and by the tactile truth of documents sliding across a table, that this would not be quick. It would be procedural, messy, and public. It might cost her marriage. It might damage livelihoods, the very thing she wanted to protect. But to do nothing felt irresponsible in a way that her mother's quiet ethics would not pardon. As she walked home, rain making the streetlights halo, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a photograph with a note that read only, "There's more to this company than ledgers." The photograph showed a flash of a ledger page where, between lines of legitimate entries, a penciled name appeared, Lang Consulting, LLC. Emily looked at it and felt time's weight. There was a line running from the funeral through that scribble to the ledger boxes that carried the lives of people she knew and people she had never met. The photograph was small and ordinary. It was enough. She had a legal plan, allies, and a set of exposures to pursue. She also had a marriage that might bend and break under the strain of public scrutiny. The night held both possibilities, the hard, slow work of justice and the unpredictable fracture of trust. She went to bed with the photograph held like a shell to her ear, listening for the sound of the tide it suggested. The case against invisibility was being assembled, step by step. The next moves would require courage and caution in equal measure. The funeral had revealed a secret. The work of revealing its consequences was just beginning. Before the next move, a small question for you. Type, "I would help," or "I would refuse," and add one short line about why. It's the kind of choice that would have shaped Emily's next month. Day 40. The day the sheriff arrived at the nonprofit was cold and precise, like someone had turned down the lights to show where shadows collected. A plain, stamped envelope had arrived at the front desk 2 days earlier. A notice of levy attached to a creditor's motion against one of Alexander's operating accounts. By the time Emily pulled up, the receptionist's face was a ledger of worry. Volunteers were reassigning themselves like people improvising a lifeboat. Levy, in law's blunt language, meant a court-mandated seizure of property to satisfy a debt. For ordinary people, it meant a supplier's payment not made, payroll that might bounce, and a cascade of practical failures. A sheriff's deputy stood politely to the side while a courthouse-issue assistant read aloud what the paper said. The nonprofit's main operating account had a hold placed on it pending a hearing. The fluorescent light hummed, the copier whirred in the background like an indifferent witness. Emily felt the ledger of Margot's trust bend under a new pressure. She had expected legal friction. She had not expected the immediate, audible panic of people who set their alarm clocks around paydays. Aisha moved through the foyer like someone who had been here before, clipboard in hand, delegations ready. She announced emergency measures, temporary payroll advances from a small emergency fund Luca had managed to mobilize, short-term vendor credits negotiated with suppliers, and a legal request for a quick hearing on the levy to ask the judge to prioritize payroll. Those measures were temporary scaffolding. They bought time and steadied people's breath. They also ensured that when Emily's team marched back into court, they could argue not just for abstract rights, but for real human needs. Women waiting for checks, a teacher's childcare program, a baker who depended on Saturday sales. "Don't let any actions make this about revenge," Aisha said as they worked, handing Emily a list of names whose livelihoods were on the line. "Make it clear this is about continuity." Emily agreed. Her grief was now threaded through spreadsheets and human names. She slept badly for nights because she could hear the printers at the nonprofit producing the emergency packets, names and amounts and short legal justifications, and because she knew that law could both save and scar. Day 50. Inside the courthouse, under a vaulted ceiling and the watchful eyes of recessed lights, Martin filed for an emergency temporary restraining order to stop any transfers from accounts that had suspicious patterns. The judge who took their motion had the slow patience of someone tasked with balancing competing urgencies. Martin presented Daniel's report in summary: consistent transfers, round number wires through nominal entities, ledger notes that suggested payment for consulting without corresponding invoices. He framed it in the language the bench liked: probability, risk of dissipation, the immediate harm to third parties if funds vanished. The judge signed a narrow TRO: stop transfers from the named accounts pending further discovery, preserve corporate books and servers, and an order for expedited initial discovery to be completed within 30 days. It was not a decisive victory, but it was a dam against a certain torrent. The clerk stamped the pages. Emily felt her fingers go numb as if she had held a hot object. The atrium smelled faintly of old coffee and judicial severity. The TRO had a side effect that Martin and Daniel had foreseen. It sharpened Alexander's public posture into something urgent and defiant. Raymond Ellis, his counsel, responded with a motion to quash certain discovery requests on grounds of overbreadth. He argued vehemently that the TRO risked impeding an operating company's ability to pay payroll and that the court should be cautious before restraining corporate accounts. In the public filing, Raymond used phrases designed to elicit sympathy: protecting the livelihood of employees and preserving operations during a tumultuous transition. The irony of the phrase was not lost on Emily. He framed the defense as though the only risk were an overreaching widow. The hearings became a chess match in pajamas of legalese and calendar motions. Each filing had human consequence. Each calendar order created new deadlines for vendor calls, new moments when a landlord might issue a final notice, new nights when workers might wonder if their check would clear. Emily began measuring days not in coffee cups but in court ticks: discovery responses due, deposition schedules, subpoenas served. Depositions began like a rain of small things. Under oath, cleaners of the corporate world told of approvals and memos, of board minutes that had ambiguous phrases, and of meeting notes where Alexander's signature sat like a small insistence. Short excerpts from testimony circulated among Emily's team and, later in redacted form, to the press. One clerk, soft-spoken, recalled a board meeting where, in the minutes, an instruction had appeared to advance funding to consultants. The deposition fragment read in court: Q. Who authorized that? A. It looks like Mr. Lang signed a resolution. Another deposition, this one from a mid-level controller at an operating company, offered: Q. Was there any supporting deliverable for that consulting fee? A. Not that I found in the file. Each small admission was a thread. Daniel translated the threads into percentages and likelihoods. Taken together, he told the judge in a formal filing, the transfers are anomalous relative to normal operating activity and insufficiently documented. It was careful, cautious wording because the law was not a drum for dramatic declarations. It was a mechanism for making probability actionable. At home, Emily had a drawer where she tucked those depositions in manila folders. The pages smelled like toner and stress. Alexander had begun to treat her differently. Less soft persuasion, more guarded politeness. He would brush against her shoulder with the practiced familiarity of someone who wanted to preserve his private life through the optics of normalcy. The more Emily saw his public insistence on his company's plight, the more the voicemail and the folios began to assemble into a moral pattern she could no longer afford to ignore. Dining room confrontation. One night, the argument they had been dancing toward finally stepped into the dining room light. The china seemed too bright, the room too small for their histories. Alexander had come back late from a meeting. His tie was loosened and his hair damp with rain. He sat down heavily and poured red wine as if the wine could reset a conversation. "You're making enemies," he said, not in anger, but in a measured, disappointed tone, the kind of sentence that intended to shame rather than to engage. "I'm trying to preserve what matters," Emily answered. "Margot left instructions. She wanted preservation, not a quick bailout." He smiled, a private, small smile that did not reach his eyes. "You think I'm stealing from her?" he asked. The question was both entreaty and accusation. "I think there are transfers and patterns that need explaining," Emily said. "Daniel's report shows the kinds of transfers we see when accounts are used to route funds. I'm asking for papers." "I gave you a family," he said suddenly, the words like a weapon and a plea at once. "You want to take that away." "I want to protect employees," she said. "I want to protect tenants. I want to honor her will." "You'll ruin us," he said, quieter now. "You'll ruin everything we built. All those good intentions of yours, what if they harm more than they help?" She felt the old ache of wanting him to be the man she had married, and the sharper, newer ache of knowing she could not close her eyes to documents. Their dinner ended with no tidy reconciliation. Instead, there was the slow, mutual recognition that they occupied different moral coordinates. He would press his counsel for an aggressive defense. She would press the law for transparency. The auction looms. Creditors moved faster than affection. Several vendor suits progressed. An unsecured creditor obtained judgment on a receivable and initiated an action that would, within weeks, place one of the operating company's larger properties into compelled public auction. That property was an anchor building with a small retail row, the exact sort of income-producing asset that Margot's trust had been designed to safeguard for local commerce. Martin called Tom Barrett, a dry-voiced auctioneer known in the city for the steady cadence with which he descended hammers. Auctions are rituals. Tom had the cadence that turned sale into spectacle without dramatics. He explained in private, "Auctions price distress. If you want to save a strip for tenants, you show up prepared. You show up with legal clarity, and you don't give the market a reason to suspect your motives." Tom's rules were not mystical. They were pragmatic. Be present, be funded, be anonymous if you must. He warned that bids sometimes trigger media attention, and that publicity could have both protective and pernicious effects. The anonymous LLC, an acquisition vehicle Martin advised Emily to form, had the purpose of preventing a public association that might prompt credit markets to panic. Martin emphasized legality. The LLC would be formed openly and duly, named in filings, and the court would be apprised of its purpose in protective terms: stewardship for tenants and continuity of service. The anonymity was about optics and protecting market function, not evasion. They had to raise funds for the bid. Margot's trust could not be used to directly buy an asset because of complex fiduciary structures. The plan, instead, required coordinated financing, a bridge loan secured through a foundation partner, and a temporary capital pool Luca worked to assemble from sympathetic investors who agreed to a covenant preventing resale for a set period. The emphasis was clear. The purchase would be structured to prioritize public continuity, not private profit. Month's end arrived. The auction notice posted on the courthouse door was brief and bureaucratic. Notice, sale of real property, Parcel A. Tom Barrett's voice that day was a metronome. Rain had started to scrape the auction lot in the morning light. Bidders clustered under a rented tent, their breath visible. The strip's tenants watched from upstairs windows, faces pressed to glass like characters in a play. Rosa's bodega smelled of fried food and worry. The auction block hummed. Bidders came in clusters. A coalition of small local investors bid for value. A distant corporate bidder, faceless and algorithmic, offered numbers that gleamed with efficiency. The anonymous LLC's representative, an unremarkable man in a gray coat with a small leather portfolio, sat at the back and watched. Emily wanted to be there but knew her presence might complicate the matter. She waited with Aisha and Luca in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, the rain making the streetlights feather. They watched a live feed Tom had arranged for the tenants. He had made a small, generous concession to provide a communal viewing. The bidding felt like counting breaths. Each increment was a possibility. If the LLC lost, the strip could be sold to a distant investor, who might not preserve rents. If the LLC won, there would be a path to convert the property into a stewarded asset. The proxy bid reached a number that made a distant corporate bidder hesitate. Then Tom's hammer came down with its dull finality. The anonymous LLC won. There was a collective exhale. Partners called lawyers and began the logistics of transfer. Tom Barrett filed the receipt, and the clerk stamped papers with the efficient indifference of officialness. The tenants sang softly in the hallways like people who had survived a storm. Leak and the press. Marta Cole, a reporter who had long covered local business and community stories, smelled a thread and followed it. She had a history with Emily's neighborhood. She had once written about a community garden that Margot had quietly funded. Marta's pieces were humane, skeptical, and small in their fury. When she received an anonymous tip about connections between Alexander's transfers and LLCs with names echoing Margot's holdings, she began asking questions. Marta's article ran with careful sourcing, redacted folios, quotes from a deposition, and a line that made the headline. Family Trust at Center of Lang Empire Scrutiny. The piece did not accuse. It presented evidence, questions, and human faces. Rosa, Aisha, and a worker named Javier who worried for his shift. Public response was immediate. Donors called the nonprofit. The operating company's creditors tightened terms. Alexander's PR machine posted statements about temporary liquidity challenges. The leak carried consequence. Pressure mounted on the board of Alexander's operating company. Investors who had once accepted his charm wanted more data. A few vendors accelerated collection. Public opinion, fickle and loud, reshaped the positions of counterparties. Day 80. The court docket thickened. Discovery had produced more materials. Emails with abbreviated references, invoices with matching numbers, and a pattern of payments that, when connected, suggested commingling. Eleanor Grant, the trustee advisor who had earlier been cautious and reserved, called Emily and asked to meet. In a small cafe with sunlight sifting down, Eleanor opened her hands like a person giving something back. She had reviewed Margot's handwritten notes and the trust's directives. Margot would have hated spectacle, she said, but she wanted the work preserved. I need to ensure the trustee acts in her intentions. Eleanor agreed to support the petition for declaratory judgment, clarifying the trust's protections, and to provide testimony about Margot's intent in any contested hearing. Her support was not unconditional. She had legal and fiduciary obligations. But her voice in court would be weighty. A trustee describing the settler's intent could tilt the judge's view toward protection rather than dissolution. Courtroom sequences that followed were not cinematic in the way movies promised. They were procedural, meticulous, and human. Depositions of board members produced small contradictions. an expense line that vanished in a spreadsheet, a meeting where minutes were palmed with euphemisms. Daniel's forensic accounting testimony tied dates of transfers to non-existent consulting deliverables. The pattern was circumstantial but coherent. Raymond Ellis argued with the ferocity of someone protecting a client's remaining reputation. My client is trying to preserve jobs. Allegations of impropriety are speculative. He pressed witnesses, prodded at language, and attempted to paint the TRO as overreaching. The judge listened and then, in a carefully reasoned order, issued a limited declaratory judgment. The trust's assets, as structured, were not marital property in the ordinary sense, and could not be subject to broad claims absent proof of fraudulent conveyance. The order did not provide a blanket shield. It left room for litigation on specific transfers if evidence demonstrated an intent to defraud creditors or to hide assets. The ruling constrained Alexander's ability to seize trust assets and allowed Emily's team to proceed with targeted litigation. The judgment was not a total victory. It was a legal recognition of Margot's intent and a narrowing of the zone in which Alexander's counsel could operate. Martin described it to Emily as a narrowing of the map. He cautioned that creditors could still press claims against operating companies and that Emily's team must move to secure assets at risk. Settlement offer. Raymond Ellis, pragmatic now that the judge had limited certain claims, sent a settlement overture. Alexander himself called and, for a moment, sounded like the man she had once known, uncertain, regretful. The offer was a number tied to a non-disclosure and an agreement that Emily would resign from active involvement in certain decisions. The implicit bargain, money and privacy in exchange for closure. Emily read the offer at her kitchen table. The number was large in the way numbers are large on paper, but smaller when measured against Margot's written wishes and the tenant's rent ledgers. A settlement would likely preserve some jobs, but would also mean Margot's trust might be diverted from community priorities into a private agreement crafted to hush. To accept would be to translate a private harm into a private repair, rather than a structural stewardship. She met with Martin, Daniel, Aisha, and Luca in a windowed room with rain making tracks down the glass. Daniel ran numbers on a whiteboard. If they accepted the settlement, what percentages of tenants would have coverage? What if they won court cost coverage and the auctioned asset was preserved? Aisha spoke for tenants. A check helps until it doesn't, she said. We need structures that offer long-term stability. Emily thought of Margot's meticulous notes about maintenance funds and emergency allocations. She thought of Gloria, the daycare operator who paid rent in 3 separate checks. Of Rosa, whose bodega had provided change for neighbors for years. She thought of the design Margot had left, not for quiet profit, but for a slow, protective broth of support around a neighborhood. She declined the settlement. It was not righteousness or vindictiveness. It was a decision, with legal and social risk, to preserve a larger public good. She told Raymond as much in a short, pointed email. Her refusal set in motion a new phase, escalated litigation on specific transfers, and a renewed push for strategic acquisitions of assets at risk. The company collapse. Over the following weeks, Alexander's operating company, anxious and over-leveraged, began to feel the strain. Credit lines tightened. A major vendor cut terms. The company's market image, once protective, began to leak in the form of canceled contracts. Employees felt the tremor. Managers called meetings to reassure staff, even as their eyes showed the arithmetic of difficulties. When a creditor foreclosed on a second property and scheduled another auction, Emily's anonymous LLC again prepared to bid. This time, the stakes felt higher. A mixed-use building where several long-term tenants paid below-market rents that were integral to the neighborhood's ecosystem. If those tenants were displaced, the ripple would be immediate. A daycare would close, a seamstress would lose orders, a small grocer would shutter. At the auction, the press were waiting in a way that made Emily's allies uneasy. Martha Cole had run an update explaining the stakes and the legal proceedings in human terms, and the community had rallied with petitions and testimonies. Tenants stood in the crowd, their faces open and anxious. The bidding was tense. Tom Barrett called numbers like a metronome. The anonymous LLC's representative held the line, slightly outbidding a distant investor. When the hammer fell, there was applause from the tenants that sounded like a small victory choir. The anonymous LLC took title and then immediately placed the property into an interim trust with explicit provisions for rent stabilization and tenant-first leasing terms for the next 3 years. Martin filed the conveyance with a public statement of purpose that framed the acquisition as a stewardship move, not opportunism. Media coverage amplified the point. A private fortune, Margot's legacy, had been redirected through lawful channels into community protection. That framing was crucial. It softened some public fears that the acquisition was a power play. It also provoked Alexander's counsel, who began to argue that Emily's actions, if coordinated with outside investors, had the potential to depress valuations deliberately. The allegations were sharp but, carefully, unproven. Consequences and mitigations. Litigation created both exposure and opportunity. Creditors attempted to stretch claims against the trust by alleging that transfers constituted fraudulent conveyances. Martin replied with precise legal arguments, and Eleanor submitted a declaration describing Margot's explicit intent. The judge, balancing risks, granted a narrowly tailored order protecting the recently purchased assets that were demonstrably being used to preserve tenants and operations. The judge's language emphasized harm mitigation, protection of livelihoods, as a factor in the calculus. While legal battles continued, Emily and her allies focused on concrete mitigation for those who might otherwise bear the brunt. Aisha's Tenant Rights Network initiated emergency rent relief, funded through a small pot Luca assembled from sympathetic philanthropic pledges and short-term bridge loans. Luca negotiated with local banks for low-cost lines tied to community stabilizers that would be repaid through nominal operating surpluses and philanthropy. They established a small emergency payroll fund that could cover 1 month of salaries for affected employees while negotiations proceeded. Those actions tempered an otherwise harsher fallout. Tenants received written assurances, temporary grants, and legal clinics that offered counsel on rights and small claims defenses. The nonprofit's legal clinic offered pro bono work for tenants facing eviction. Emily visited storefronts, not with the glare of litigation, but with packets of assistance, letters of intent, signed documents showing commitments to maintain lease terms, and an open calendar for community meetings. There were collateral casualties. Some vendors lost money, and 2 middle managers at Alexander's firm were laid off as lines tightened. Emily grieved those losses. She instructed Luca to arrange transition assistance where possible. She insisted that any measure she took be accompanied by dignity. Advanced notice for employees facing layoffs, severance when feasible, and placement assistance. She refused to allow public vindictiveness that would unnecessarily punish the innocent. Relationship with Daniel. Amid litigation and acquisitions, small human things unfurled. Daniel, who had been by turns clinical and patient, proved reliable in ways that were not purely professional. He stayed late to review spreadsheets, but he also brought back leftover coffee on days Emily had forgotten to eat. They spoke about numbers, and then about ordinary things, their mother's recipes, bad films they both loved. He did not fill silence with platitudes. He listened as Emily spoke of Margot. He admired her stubbornness without turning it into a therapy session. Their relationship evolved carefully and with attention to the moral texture of what Emily was doing. There was no rush, no theatrical romance. It was a relationship built on shared values, mutual respect, and an appreciation of the difference between being needed and being loved. 6 months later, those small gestures, an early morning text with a citation Emily needed, a hand on an arm at the dedication, coalesced into something steady. Transformation, from acquisition to community center. With 2 anchor properties secured and legal protections in place, Emily began to shape a public plan that would honor Margot's intentions. The strategy was practical and layered. Stabilize rent and leases for a defined period, create a maintenance and repair fund drawn from modest operating surpluses, and transform a contained portion of one of the properties into a formal community hub, Margot Community Center. The hub would include an affordable retail corridor, a legal clinic for tenants and small businesses, a job training workshop in collaboration with the local community college, and a small microloan fund for entrepreneurs. It would house a rotating classroom for financial literacy and basic accounting. Daniel's idea, practical and quietly revolutionary for people who had never had access to such knowledge. They mapped milestones. 1 month, immediate stabilization. Emergency grants to 12 tenants, 3 payroll advances for nonprofit staff, and a commitment letter to Rosa guaranteeing current lease terms for 18 months. A legal clinic open 2 days a week with 5 volunteer attorneys offering initial consultations. A published schedule of workshops, financial literacy, small business coaching, and tenant rights seminars ensured that the community could see a path forward. 3 months. Programming scale. The center launched a financial literacy program attended by 40 participants in its first 6-week run. The legal clinic had handled 20 intake cases, preventing at least 6 evictions through negotiated settlements and temporary rent arrangements. The microloan fund issued its first 3 small loans to local entrepreneurs with mentorship attached. The Anchor retail strip reported a small uptick in foot traffic as local media covered the center's classes and events. Employment numbers stabilized for 60 employees connected to businesses in the trust's properties. 6 months. Institutionalization and metrics. The Margot Community Center had a modest but functioning governance board that included tenants, community leaders, and a trustee representative. The maintenance fund had paid for urgent roof repairs on 1 building, averting an expected closure. The legal clinic had expanded to 3 days a week and had a pro bono student partnership with the local law school. A set of metrics, number of tenants with stabilized leases, number of payrolls preserved, number of clinic clients assisted, was published in a quarterly report to maintain transparency. Emily insisted on transparency because she wanted the center to be a bulwark against suspicion. They published an annual stewardship report detailing income, expenses, and the covenant preventing sale for a period of years unless a community vote agreed. The report was a deliberate performance of good faith, numbers laid out beside names and faces. Marta Cole's reporting, once speculative, now described a tangible outcome. Her tone was measured and sober. A hidden trust revealed at a funeral has become a source of public protection, she wrote. The legal process has not produced a simple ending, but a complicated stewardship. Her article included interviews with tenants, Rosa wiping her hands on an apron, Gloria hugging a parent outside the daycare, and with Eleanor, who spoke about Margot's desire to keep life going in small ways. Final legal resolution. Alexander's legal exposure never fully evaporated. There was a settlement in which his operating company agreed to pay certain monies to creditors and to accept oversight of certain transfers. He accepted personal financial constraints that significantly reduced his control over the firm. The court approved a consent order requiring stricter transparency around intra-company transfers and subjecting certain past transfers to forensic review. Alexander agreed to step down from an executive role pending an independent audit and was required to participate in a neutral mediators program. It was not the total ruin some had hoped for, nor was it a clean exoneration. It was proportional, public accountability, constrained claims against the trust, and a set of enforceable obligations. Emily refused a private buy-off and instead pursued public stewardship. The resolution reflected that choice. Epilogue, 6 months later. On a bright autumn morning 6 months after the funeral, the neighborhood gathered under a low sky that promised blue. The community center's front windows were polished. Paint smelled faintly of fresh possibility. A small plaque had been affixed near the door, the Margot Center, in memory of Margot Reynolds, whose quiet stewardship sustained neighbors and nurtured resilience. The plaque's letters caught the sun and sent a small, steady reflection onto the sidewalk. The ceremony was modest. Aisha spoke first, voice steady and proud. She recounted the nights when tenants feared eviction and the days when community volunteers delivered lunches to workers whose checks had been delayed. Luca described the microloan recipient who had expanded her business from a single cart to a storefront. Daniel spoke about accounting, not as an abstraction, but as a tool that could translate